This podcast is Challenging Opinions and is presented by William Campbell.
Thank you for downloading the Challenging Opinions podcast for December 10th, 2018. Opinion towards Muslims is a shibboleth for a whole slew of other political views at present. It is the central dispute of the culture war that we find ourselves in. Today I'm talking to someone who is very much on one side of that debate.
Challenging Opinions is the podcast where ideas are tested. Whether you are left or right, conservative or progressive, devout or skeptic. What matters is the strength of your argument, not the strength of your voice.
And coming up for you in this podcast, whenever you, on the path of your argument, pass by a comment that can be made negatively about Islam, you can't resist making it.
Since when is speaking facts the wrong thing?
Oh, it's not the wrong thing.
Everything that I've told you about Muhammad is precise and true and can be documented in any court.
However, your selection of the facts gives away the direction of your apologia.
I agree. My apologia is this. I tell you what Muhammad said and did and how it applies to the world today. I tell you what's in the Quran and how it applies to the world today, if you practice it.
That's coming up in a moment. But first, as I'm recording this, the UK government is preparing for a vote on Theresa May's deal with the EU to do Brexit in an orderly way. She's certain to be defeated, most likely by a huge margin. What happens next is almost impossible to say because the House of Commons is split into multiple factions, with MPs of various parties wanting to stay in the EU or take May's deal and leave, or leave the EU with no deal at all. There's a large majority against every possible outcome, and a very real chance that May or her entire government will fall out of office, and there's no obvious successor who can do any better at uniting either the MPs or the population, so there's sure to be instability. The UK has long since given up on trying to pursue any other policy goals. They've been preoccupied by this for nearly 3 years, and there's no end in sight. Across the Atlantic, President Trump seems to be staring down the barrel of Robert Mueller's prosecution for campaign finance violations and possibly more serious charges. Observers of the White House have various opinions of Trump, Mueller, and any possible charges, but nobody disagrees that this is the sole focus of the administration at the moment. As in the UK, almost everything else is on hold. There's strong evidence that Russian military intelligence put a lot of resources into promoting the Brexit vote in the UK and the candidacy of Donald Trump. You might have different opinions as to why they did that and whether they made any difference, but we can certainly see what Putin wanted, even if we don't agree on anything else. But consider this. Think of a point sometime in the near future. The UK is struggling to appoint a new Prime Minister. President Trump is all consumed by fighting criminal charges. If you were Putin and you wanted to launch a full-scale invasion of Ukraine or the Baltic states or Poland, what moment would you choose to do it?
Do you agree? Do you disagree? If you want your point of view heard, email podcast@challengingopinions.com and say what you think.
On the line now, I have Bill Warner. Bill Warner is the author of a number of books, including several on political Islam. He is the author of the website politicalislam.com, and he's the director of the Center for the Study of Political Islam. Bill, you're not a Muslim, so why this focus on political Islam?
Well, I think first we need to define what political Islam is, but before we define what political Islam is, I think we need to define what Islam is. Which oddly enough, hardly anyone ever references anything to. Most people think that Islam is a religion and its doctrine is found within the Quran, but that's only half true, or maybe even not even that much, because we see that if we look at the Quran very closely, there's not enough in it to be a Muslim. The 5 pillars of Islam are not found within the Quran, but we do find a clue here, which is there's 89 verses which state that all humanity is to follow Muhammad as the perfect example. He's the divine human prototype. And we find Muhammad in his Sirah, his biography, and the Hadith, his traditions. So we find that Islam, therefore, is the doctrine found in the Quran, the Sirah, and the Hadith, his traditions. And it's more about Muhammad than it is about Allah. But let's make one further thing here. Once we define what Islam is, this doctrine found in the Quran, the Sirah, and the Hadith, what we find there's something very peculiar about it. Most of the doctrine of Islam is not about how to be a Muslim. It's how to treat the non-Muslim, the kafir. So political Islam I define as the part of Islamic doctrine that deals with the non-Muslim, the kafir.
Okay.
So
when you say most of that, how are you measuring that?
Word count.
Okay.
If we take the Quran, the Sirah, and the Hadith and count all the words, 51% of those words are directed towards the non-Muslim, 49% are directed towards the Muslim on how to be a good Muslim.
Okay. I think it's fair to say, looking at you, I haven't had the chance to read any of your books, apologies for that, but I've been going through your website, and I think it's reasonable to say that you are stridently anti-Islam. Why? What's your core objection?
Well, we say that political Islam is about the kafir, the non-Muslim. It's how the kafir is defeated, defined, and how he's treated. The kafir is lower than an animal. He's the worst of all human beings. And Muhammad committed 95 acts of jihad against the kafir in the last 9 years of his life. So being a kafir under Islam is a painful process.
Looking at what you're saying, I have to say that actually, it's slightly uncomfortable for me to say a lot of the things that you say I actually agree with. I am deeply suspicious of an awful lot of religions, and of religions, Islam is certainly not the one I would be most sympathetic towards. But when I'm looking at the focus that you have on that and setting up a website that you're the author of, politicalislam.com and so forth, it seems to me that there's an undertone there that is seeking to expose the worst of Islam and make the worst possible interpretation of that worst. And if I were to do that to any other religion, I think you could make it look just as bad. These are documents that were written in the Iron Age that simply by people, and by the way, I don't give any credence at all to the idea that it was dictated by God. These were written by man, and anything written in the Iron Age had no contemplation of the modern world, and the modern world basically bears no relation to it, despite the fact that it is, of course, along with other holy documents, quite influential. Are you really sure that you're being fair in focusing like that?
Well, let's say this. Everyone seems to be aware of all the shortcomings of Judaism and Christianity. And so I merely tend to the part of the knowledge.
I'm not sure about that.
Well, anyway, let's take a specific example instead of generalities. There's a verse in the Quran which says that a Muslim can beat his wife. There's a hadith by Muhammad which says that never ask a man why he beats his wife. Now, what are we to take about this wife beating? Is we just to simply ignore it and say, well, that was then, this is now?
No, absolutely not. These are horrific verses, but they were pretty much standard fare for the time. And there are verses in the Bible that say slaves should submit to their masters, and that if a girl, not a woman, a girl is not a virgin on her wedding night, that she should be put to death. Now, despite, and I don't like whataboutism, I have to say. However, I'm using that just to make the point that there are horrific verses in what are the supposedly holy texts of more than one religion, and modern practicers of those religions, many of them at least, are entirely worthy people who pay no attention to those verses.
See, now you're talking about Muslims, which I don't talk about. A Muslim can choose to practice as little or as much of the Islamic doctrine as he chooses. Therefore, I don't discuss Muslims and their failings or shortcomings or successes. I stay with discussing the words on paper. I stay with talking about Muhammad and Allah. And by the way, those are defined to be eternal. The Quran is eternally perfect.
Yeah, that's
It's
a
not just,
huge
well, that
problem.
was
That's a
then and this
huge
is
problem
now.
for Islamic reformists, that the Bible, at least most Christians, though not all, feel at liberty to interpret and reinterpret verses of the Bible, and some of the verses of the Bible are unintelligible, and they can be interpreted in almost any way that Christians choose to do that. Muslims are dealing with a much more fixed and much more inflexible text. That is a real problem, I would agree. But you made a distinction there that you don't deal with you don't deal with Muslims, you deal with political Islam. Are you sure that's not a distinction without a difference?
A Muslim is a person to have a pulse rate. Islamic doctrine are words on paper. I can easily distinguish between a human being and a book.
Yeah.
You can too.
But and the same is true of Christianity, of Judaism, of any other religion that has a holy text. I could study the more terrible verses of the Bible, but where does that get us?
Well, then you would just be studying the terrible verses of the Bible, and I think it would be appropriate for you to ask a Christian or a Jew, will you condemn and reject this? I think we should do the same with Muslims. We should say to a Muslim, do you condemn Muhammad for beating his wife? Do you condemn the Quran for saying you can beat his wife? Will you reject that and abjure it? I think that's a legitimate question for a Muslim. What do you think?
I think it is a legitimate question, and I think most Muslims would fudge the answer. But I think that most Christians fudge the answer as well, and they just don't tend to read, or at least don't pay any attention to the verses of the Bible that are uncomfortable in the modern age. Shouldn't Muslims get the same latitude?
I agree, but if you'll notice in our conversation, you seem to keep directing it towards the topic of
sure, and I agree with that. That's actually a good point, and I want to agree with you on that whataboutism is not necessarily valid. Somebody being a terrible person is not excused, or somebody having a terrible religion is not excused by somebody else having an only slightly less terrible religion.
Okay. So my point is this. I'm an expert on what Muhammad did and said. I'm an expert on what Allah says in the Quran, if we can use that phraseology. And by the way, I do not believe that Allah, quote, wrote the Quran. But those are just the things that my expertise is about. That's what I discuss and talk about. For instance, I do things like, we usually get around to the question of the Crusades, for instance. So I do a statistical analysis of the Crusades. I've done a statistical analysis of all the Kafirs killed in jihad over 1,400 years. So these are the kind of things I bring to the table, which are generally unpleasant. And by the way, your questions are very tepid in compared to what I'm usually called, because the Southern Poverty Law Center in America has said that I'm one of America's worst racist, hater, bigoted Islamophobes.
I'm glad that you said that, because I didn't particularly want to bring that up, but I think sometimes we have to tell the listeners what's going on. But since you said it, then it's out there. But I try to engage with everybody on a rational basis, and even if I disagree with you, I think actually it's more important to engage with you on a rational basis. And you've expressed very clearly what you're doing about doing a very mathematical, counting-based analysis of Islam and of the Crusades and so forth. Why?
Why?
Yeah.
Because there's so much ignorance about it. It turns out I'm the first person who ever counted up a lot of these things to show their importance.
And what is their importance?
Well, if we're going to talk about Muslims, we need to be able to talk about Islam. And if we're going to talk about Islam, we need to know what the Islamic doctrine is. We need to know its characteristics. For instance, it has the characteristic of being dualistic.
Explain what that is.
Dualism is the fact that contradictory thoughts are true in Islam. I just gave you one quote from Muhammad, never ask a man why he beats his wife. Well, there's another hadith which says, don't strike Allah's handmaidens. We find that the Quran is a very contradictory document. And so what most people try to figure out is which one is the right interpretation. And I say they're both simultaneously true, and this is ethical dualism.
And what's the pertinence of that to us in 2018?
Well, let's give an example. Everybody knows nice Muslims, but the nice Muslims, there are two Qurans. Were you aware of that fact?
No.
There's an early Quran written in Mecca and a latter Quran written in Medina. These two books are not remotely the same, and yet they're included in the same binding. So we find that the Quran written in Mecca is without jihad, but we find that the Quran written in Medina, 24% of its text is devoted to jihad, which is the real Quran. They're both equally real. and you can practice whichever one you want, even though they contradict each other. But the Quran goes further to say is that the latter verse is more powerful and better than the earlier verse. So all the early verses which preach religion of Islam without jihad are trumped or are canceled to some degree by the later ones which call for jihad against the kafir. So this is dualism.
I understand, and I think probably studying these texts in an academic way, in a scholarly way, is probably a useful thing to do. But, and you've mentioned your interaction with the SPLC, do you have any sympathy for the view that this and I think you would have to acknowledge this is a hostile study of Islam. Do you have any sympathy for the view that this is feeding sectarian frictions that exist in the world today?
So let me get this straight. You're saying since I quote Muhammad and Allah that I'm feeding discontent?
I'm not making the statement. I'm asking you, do you have any sympathy for the view that this quite pejorative, quite hostile study of the Quran, and you may be factually correct in everything you say, but publishing this quite hostile material feeds a sectarianism that has nothing got to do with Iron Age Arabia, that has to do with the current Western world?
Well, I think it very much deals with the current Western world. That's the reason to talk about it. I mean, we find that we have Europe being filled with people who want to adhere to Sharia instead of the Western concept of
roll
law.
Back. We find where being filled with these people?
Europe.
Okay, well, I'm in Europe at the moment, and I meet Muslim people, I guess, possibly more often than I realize, because I don't ask people their religion when I meet them. But I don't recognize that.
Well, I do. I mean, there's a great deal of crime that goes on in... what about, let's take an act of jihad. Do you recognize that?
Well, I would not recognize it as being religious as the person who carries it out would be, but as terrorism, I'm aware of it, of course.
Now, when you use the word terrorism, you're using an interesting word. See, I use the word jihad because the word terrorism really is not part of the Islamic doctrine. That's something brought to us by political scientists and present-day political commentators.
Yep.
So what I think we should do is adhere to the terminology contained within Islam instead of trying to create nicer words. Let's use the words that they use.
Well, I'm not intending to use a nicer word, and I would not submit to the paradigm that they are seeking to impose. However, if you want to use that terminology, I'm not hung up on the word. What's your view on it?
Well, when Muslims say that we want to practice Sharia, they're adhering to the doctrine. Now, you may call it an Iron Age doctrine, but it's one that they adhere to. And so what we find is that at least in the United States, we're seeing things happen which accommodate themselves to Sharia law. And what I try to do to people is to say, look, this is what Sharia law is, and this is what it looks like when it's implemented. And when you like to know this before you start saying yes or no at a school board meeting.
First of all, I agree that there is a small number, and it's a very small fraction, of Muslims in the West who have an attachment to Sharia law, and whether they have the same understanding of it as you do is another question. But most Muslims in the West are entirely secular people. Actually, most people who are marked down in censuses as Muslims, sorry, not most, but a very large proportion nevertheless, are in fact atheists and have no religious faith at all. Most of them are entirely secular people who are perhaps nominally religious but don't practice that faith at all. And the proportion of nominal Muslims who are actually practicing Muslims is really quite small. And within that, most people are entirely reasonable, as are the adherents of most faiths. But I don't want to minimize the reality that there is a problematic cohort of people there. But I think trying to extend that to all of the people who are nominally Muslims just because of the country that their parents or grandparents or maybe they immigrated from, that's an entirely different thing. And you seem to be minimizing that difference.
I can't help but notice in conversation you keep talking about Muslims who barely practice Islam as though they're the proper Muslim.
Oh, no, Islam, I don't think they're the proper Muslim. I think they're just the normal Muslim. They are the most common type.
Well, there was a survey done recently about a year ago, and it was many of the Muslims who are in Europe now, roughly 40% of them said they preferred Sharia. So that's not a small number to me, but it seems to be a small number to you.
I would want to see the source for that figure, but nevertheless, go ahead.
Well, I'm just, since I'm sitting at my desk with the earphones in, I can't whirl around and pick up a book that's behind me.
Indeed. But but if you send me that source, I will put it in the show notes
I'll be
for
glad
that.
to do that.
Let's develop the argument on that basis in any case.
Anyway, a Muslim that is adherent to the doctrine of Islam, and the more they adhere to it, the more they call out for Islam. For Sharia. Mm-hmm. So we're in a peculiar position here where you seem to be saying that the best of Muslims are those who practice the least of Islam, and I'm saying that the best of Muslims are those who practice the most of Islam.
I wouldn't make the value judgment, but I would observe, for example, not many generations ago, we had slavery outlawed, first of all, in the British Empire and then in the United States. And William Wilberforce, somebody who has the name that we both have, was the leading force for abolishing slavery in the British Empire. And he was an extraordinary individual. He made it essentially his life's work, and he was successful, I think, shortly before his own death, or at least he was quite elderly when he managed to succeed in that. He based his political crusade on his own Christian faith. However, if you take a rational look at the Bible, there is nothing in the Bible that prohibits slavery. And there's plenty of verses in the Bible that explicitly endorse the mechanisms of slavery. So you could, if one was to be somebody arguing in favor of slavery, it would seem that if the Bible was your guide, they were on the right side. And what I would argue is that there's an analogous process going on in Islam at the moment, in that, as you said, a huge amount of there's a huge amount of contradiction, and things can be reinterpreted and so forth. The people who say they are Muslims are, and I don't want to comment one way or the other on whether I accept that they're Muslims or not, but they are almost all entirely reasonable people who are, for probably cultural reasons rather than anything else, say that they're Muslims, and then work quite hard to find justification in their religion for the sort of morality that they believe in otherwise. And that's pretty much what Christians do as well, isn't it?
We're back to comparative analysis, but since we're dealing with that, let's enter the fact that Muhammad was a slave owner. Yeah. He tortured slaves. He had a sex slave. He had Arab slaves, black slaves, white slaves. He received slaves as gift. He gave slaves as gift. His favorite sexual partner was a sex slave. Muhammad was very much involved in the slave trade. Mm-hmm. And as a matter of fact, since you were discussing Wilberforce, we need to understand that all those evil white men on the wooden ships that had slaves that were coming to America, mm-hmm. all of those slaves were sold to them by Muslim jihadists. Sure. Muslims ran the slave trade.
I understand that. I mean, I'm no defender of Iron Age practices, no matter who was doing them, and I'm no defender of people behaving badly. But do you not understand that the direction of your apologia, that whenever you, on the path of your argument, pass by a comment that can be made negatively about Islam, you can't resist making it?
Since when is speaking facts the wrong thing?
Oh, it's not the wrong thing.
Everything that I've told you about Muhammad is precise and true and can be documented in any court.
Absolutely. However, your selection of the facts gives away the direction of your apologia.
I agree. My apologia is this. I tell you what Muhammad said and did and how it applies to the world today. I tell you what's in the Quran and how it applies to the world today, if you practice it. Mm-hmm. And indeed, it is being practiced. There are slaves being sold in Africa today by mm-hmm. Muslims. Mm-hmm. The Muslim slave market in Mecca closed in 1964. Mm-hmm. These are all facts. I find them not objectionable at all.
However, I could, if I chose to, select very pejorative facts from other religions, facts about their holy book or whatever, and about bad behavior of adherents to that religion, and paint a picture that was dramatically more prejudicial and dramatically more negative than a true representation. And I'm wondering if you're not doing that about Islam.
Well, we come back to this true representation thing. You keep wanting to say Islam is what Muslims say it is. I keep saying
no, I
that
don't.
Islam is what
No, I do
Muhammad
not.
and the Quran
I
say
do
it
not.
is.
I'm going after what you mentioned earlier, duality. That if we don't, I 100% understand what you're saying, that there is a written text that says what Islam is, and anybody reading that would come away, if they were in any way a decent human being, would come away with an extremely negative view of Islam and therefore anybody who adheres to it. But the reality just doesn't bear that out in terms of the human beings.
What is the reality you're referring to?
The reality is that most Muslims observe Islam in the same way that most Christians observe Christianity. Most people are good people in the world, and they're told from whenever they're born that they're Muslims and that they should be, their mother wags their finger at them and says you should be a good Muslim, and being a Muslim means you shouldn't steal and you shouldn't rob people and you shouldn't do anything bad. And people have their own morality, and they then meld the religion and what they know about it around their own morality.
So, are you advancing the argument that the less of Islam you practice, the better off we are?
Oh, for sure. If you're looking at the original text, yeah, absolutely. But that's true of other religions too.
But again, we're back to the comparative religion. And
that's true of religions in general.
And I don't discuss Christianity. I discuss what's written down about Muhammad and the Quran.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's a very simple thing what I do.
Mm-hmm.
That's true, everything that I say is fact-based. I can give you a reference for it.
Yeah, I agree.
And it's not just a simple verse or two. Remember I told you that jihad is 24% of the Quran written in Medina.
I understand what you're saying. But what you're doing is in the context of a wider world where there is a very sharp cultural divide that Muslims, perhaps unwillingly, find themselves on one side of. And to put it in context, there is an organization called the IRA, which is not the Irish Republican Army, the Internet Research Agency, which is part of Russian military intelligence, based in St. Petersburg, which has been promoting Facebook pages and bots and Twitter bots and creating groups both opposed to and in favor of Islam in the United States. And they've managed to create street demonstrations, rival street demonstrations on the streets of Texas. And the reason they're doing that is to sow discord within the US because they wish to damage the United States and to make society less cohesive in the US. And I'm wondering, I'm sure unwillingly, but are you not serving that same agenda?
I don't understand how quoting the facts of Muhammad and Allah are serving that agenda. I simply don't get your drift.
Well, if every time, I don't know if you're a Christian, but if you were a Christian and every time you met a Christian, somebody said, yeah, Christianity endorses slavery and Christianity endorses rape and Christianity endorses murdering rape victims, and those were the most prominent things you knew about Christianity and therefore about Christians, that would be an extremely negative thing, and that doesn't fairly represent the great majority of Christians. I'm not disputing that you're absolutely correct in most of the things. I say most because I'm not able to check them all, but I will take you on faith and accept that you're correct in everything you say about Islam and about political Islam. But what I'm saying is that doing that and having that exclusive and very negative focus on Islam is something that is damaging to society.
I miss your point. I simply miss your point that talking about facts and the truth of the matter is something that's bad. And by the way, when I meet a Muslim, I don't jump all over their case about how much of the doctrine they're following. What I do instead is work in reverse. Mm-hmm. For instance, there's a lot of rapes now being had in Sweden, and they're usually
it's a myth
connected to the migrants.
This is, and I've got facts and figures on this. This is a talking point in the alt-right echo chambers that in some way that
what is alt-right?
Alt-right is self-defined, but I guess they are a newer online right-wing subculture.
I'm curious. Is what I do talking about Islam and Quran, is that alt-right?
That's up to yourself to define. Nevertheless, there are a slew of websites that define themselves as alt-right, and they have
I don't do that.
I accept that, but they have one of their core talking points is that because Sweden has had Muslim immigrants, that there is in some way an increase in rape in Sweden. That's been clearly examined, and it's entirely false.
Okay, we'll drop that point. Well, let's take another one. You can tell me whether this is all right or not.
Sure.
You know who Asia Bibi is? She's a Christian. You've been talking about Christians.
Yes, she's a Christian convert in Pakistan, which is a country that is, to put it very mildly, hostile to Christian converts.
But when they reveal their hostility, they say it's because she blasphemed Muhammad.
Yeah.
Well, now, this is I can't say if it's an entire nation, but a large portion of the nation wants to kill her.
Yes. I don't agree. A large portion.
This is what I would bring to the argument. There's a reason why they do this. Muhammad had people killed who blasphemed him.
Can I just give the listeners a very short background on Asia Bibi? She is a woman, formerly a Muslim, converted to Christianity, which is, to put it at its mildest, controversial in Pakistan, which is a country that is, from memory, certainly far more than 95% Muslim. She has been imprisoned. She has been subject to threats of murder, and I think I'm not clear on her current status, whether she's still in Pakistan, but her life is most certainly.
Where do the Pakistanis get their motives to treat her this way?
Okay, first of all, I'm going to take issue with your using the word the Pakistanis. There are people in Pakistan, and no small number of people in Pakistan, I would agree, who are baying for her blood, and this is stoked up essentially by people who are trying to achieve political ends by hyping up the dangers of Christianity in Pakistan and hyping up people. And yeah, they, without a doubt, they have managed to whip up a mob. I don't believe that the majority of people in Pakistan would wish any harm on Asia Bibi. And from the Pakistani people I know, they are horrified by the way the woman has been treated. That's a pretty small sample base, though, I'd have to agree. So I want to agree with you to a degree that that woman has been treated absolutely appallingly, and that would not happen in almost any Christian country, probably any Christian country at all. But I don't agree with the conclusion that all Muslims agree with that treatment of her.
I didn't say that. I just said those who do treat her that way have a doctrinal reason for doing so.
I think they have a doctrinal excuse.
Well, Muhammad ordered people killed because they wrote a poem he didn't like.
The Bible orders women who are not virgin when they get married to be killed. You can't take any of that too seriously.
Is that no religious text should be referenced, and we should all just run on our own personal morality. I have no objection to that, by the way. That seems to be what you're saying.
It is. So let me put it this way. I think Sam Harris said about Islam was that ideas matter and ideas influence how people behave. And that seems to be close to your position on that. And I agree. Yes. I agree, but only to a certain extent, because ideas can only exist in an environment where they are able to survive and where those ideas are contrary to the prevailing culture. They can't survive. So when you have Muslims who move to the West, first of all, you're selecting for people who feel more affinity with Western values to begin with. But secondly, within a very short period of time, those people overwhelmingly move much closer to Western values. And there
are those who would dispute that fact. It would appear that some of the young in Europe who have been raised and born in Europe are more Islamic than their parents.
You're correct on that. There are some on that. I would suggest that those people who are raised in Europe, but raised excluded from Western society, excluded from mainstream society, and what they do. So I certainly wouldn't deny that there's a problem there, but they are people who are physically located in the West.
And your point is?
My point is that this very, very sharp focus, entirely with true facts, as you say, and I would concede, but this very sharp focus on the most negative aspects of Islam is feeding a frenzy of suspicion and paranoia about Muslims in general, most of whom have no truck with the ideas that is being attributed to them.
So we keep coming back to this. Christians have bad stuff too, and not all Muslims obey the doctrine. I keep coming back to my thing. All I do is talk about the doctrine. I don't talk about Muslims. You talk
That's
about
true.
Muslims.
I agree with that, but I could.
You do understand that if you want to talk about Muslims, you can get any result you want. You ask a nice Muslim, you get a nice Islam.
True.
If you ask a member of Islamic State, you get a Muslim that you would not like.
Yeah, that's absolutely
true.
Yes.
You're indulging. Here's the difference between you and me as I see it. I study Islam, and you study Muslimology.
Well, I don't study Muslimology. However, I take your point. But here's my core point, my one difficulty with what you're doing. What you're doing seems to me to be at least partly analogous with the hysterical stoking up of fever pitch mobs against Christians that happens in Pakistan. And it's entirely possible a rabble-rouser in Pakistan could use true facts, as you say, true facts about Christianity, about Christians, and present them in such a pejorative way as to whip up a mob who are likely to lynch Christians. That's morally wrong. I'm not suggesting that you're on the same level, but I'm just saying that we don't even want to go one step down that road, do we?
So I'm trying to get your point. So what you seem to be saying is we shouldn't study all of the doctrine of Islam. We should only study the doctrine of Islam that we like.
No.
I don't get that.
I'm saying that we shouldn't devote undue attention to the exclusion of other, perhaps more relevant facts that we could study.
Well, what would you advise me to do with my knowledge?
I wouldn't presume to tell you what to do. And you're absolutely entitled to do what you do. The question that really I'm trying to get a clear answer from you is this helpful?
Well, it's helpful to me. Let me give you an example of how it's helpful to me. After a talk I gave in Chicago a couple of months ago, a man came up to me and said, I started reading your books 3 years ago, and I realized that a whole portion of my life was wasted. I said, What do you mean? He said, I was an interrogator in Afghanistan for the U.S. military. And he says, after reading your books, I understood that they never told us anything about Islam, and particularly the ethics of Islam. He said, all of my work was wasted because I knew too little about the people I was talking to. So now then my question to you is, if you're dealing with an interrogator who's in Afghanistan, interviewing Taliban captives, should he know the doctrine of Islam in its fullest?
I think he should know all of the relevant information, and that probably is included in that. But if he knows more about the doctrines of Islam than the person he's interrogating, then that's probably more information than is useful.
Are you aware of, if you want to join Islamic State or the Taliban or Al-Qaeda, the first thing they do with you as a volunteer, they don't take you down to the firing range. They instead start teaching you the doctrine of Islam. In particular, the doctrine of Islam is found in the Medinan Quran. So I think, therefore, it's only suitable that if you're going to be interrogating people who are a member of this group, that you understand what they know.
I accept your point. I accept your point on that that is important. But I would argue that the culture of those countries has a large influence of Islam, but that is by no means the only influence. And the practices of those countries are more influenced by the culture. So for example, Iceland.
They say they're more influenced by the Islam, but you say they're influenced by the culture. Whom should I listen to, you or them?
Well, that's a choice for you to make. But for example, Iceland and Honduras are both overwhelmingly Christian countries. You couldn't get more starkly different culture, and that's why those two countries are so different. So I would suggest, and the range within Islam, I would agree, is narrower. But for example, Bosnia and Saudi Arabia are both Muslim countries, and that's a very, very broad cultural difference.
Let me give you another example. I went to Kosovo one time on a tour of the Balkans, and in Kosovo, which is an Islamic nation, you can order pizza with salami on it, you can order a beer, and you can buy gambling tickets. And I said, this is an Islamic nation?
Yeah.
So I mentioned this to my host, and he says, oh, He says these Muslims here haven't gone to the mosque probably in their life. Their grandfather went to the mosque. They call themselves Muslims, but they don't practice it. I said, really? He said, the mosques here are empty on Friday. He said, but there's a new kind of mosque being built now. There's a new kind of Muslim coming to Kosovo. And the new kind of mosque is run out of Saudi Arabia and Turkey. And they're very filled with young men who are all fully Sharia compliant. He said, Kosovo is changing.
Yeah, why do you think Saudi Arabia is funding them?
Well, Saudi Arabia funds most of the mosques here in the United States.
Yeah, I know. Why?
Why? Because he who pays the piper calls the tune.
Absolutely. They're trying to buy political power.
And so your point, I'm not sure what these people preach is the doctrine of Islam in their mosque.
Yeah, they would preach anything at all that bought them political power. But you're absolutely correct. And it's an enormous issue, that largely secular countries, Kosovo and Bosnia are the two Muslim countries, or majority Muslim countries in Europe. They are as secular or more so than any of the Christian countries in Europe. But you are right that there is this influence which comes with money from Saudi Arabia, which is essentially the money that you pay to put gas in your car. That's where it's ending up, at least some of it. But I think that bears out my point.
Well, the point is the Kosovo that I like, where I can buy a beer and have salami on my pizza and buy a gambling ticket, is not adherent to the Islamic doctrine.
No,
and once it is adherent
to
the Islamic doctrine, I won't be able to get that pepperoni on my pizza.
Bill Warner, we've, I think, exhausted the topic. I hope you I hope you enjoy the salami and the beer and can buy a lottery ticket and exercise all your other freedoms for a long time to come. Bill Warner, author of politicalislam.com and director of the Center for the Study of Political Islam. Thank you very much for talking to me.
Well, thank you, sir. I've enjoyed it.
Make your view heard. Email podcast@challengingopinions.com to set out your ideas and defend them on the next podcast.
Go to the website for sources and links to what we were talking about. And Bill, as promised, sent me his sources for some of the claims he made. I've included them on the page for this podcast. But just a note on one of the sources he sent. It's from the Gatestone Institute, an organization that claims to be a think tank, but in reality is a fake news mill, cranking out stories that are either gross misrepresentations of the facts or just plain false. I actually covered one of their claims in a previous podcast. Look up podcast 66 if you want to hear that. But it's notable that one of the sources that the Gatestone Institute cite is, in fact, from a BBC journalist, Ruth Alexander, who produced a piece with a whole slew of statistics. And she's saying the exact opposite of what the Gatestone Institute claimed she was saying. Anyway, while you're on the website, please like the show on Facebook, follow @ChallengingO on Twitter, and follow Bill Warner @PoliticalIslam if you can. His account is blocked by Twitter in some countries. Twitter says it's to comply with local laws. And you can get in touch with me if you can suggest a guest or topic for a future show. Also, you can find out how to subscribe to the podcast for free on your computer, on your phone, or by email. And you can support the podcast on Patreon, thanks to the people who signed up for that so far. You can find all of that at www.challengingopinions.com. The Challenging Opinions podcast is produced and presented by me, William Campbell. Thank you for listening.